Okay, this time we're going to talk about emotions. Last time we talked about motivational strategies like defensive pessimism versus optimism. I know a lot of these little videos are super short, but I'm trying to break them down into like small little chunks because I know as the semester has gone on, our attention spans have gotten shorter and shorter. I can see it in the video retention. So my hope is that by making these more of them, y'all will watch more of it. So yeah. So we're going to talk about emotion. We can think of emotion as a type of procedural knowledge. So this is knowledge that cannot be learned or fully expressed through words, but can be through action and experience. So we can kind of think of this as like a set of mental and physical procedures, like how the body and mind respond, like is part of emotion. Now, I am not an emotion expert. I really encourage you to check out Christian Wa's course on emotion. He is, and he's one of my go-to brain people, where I check and ask him about like, does this really link to this emotion, or is this study bullshit? He's one of my many go-to people about the brains and the feelings. So, yeah, it's a set of processes. Now, you can kind of think about it as like a couple of basic stages. These can happen at the same time or in like different orders than what I've laid out here. So the basic stages are appraisal, where you're judging a stimulus to be emotionally relevant or not. These may sound a little familiar to personality judgment. They're similar for a good reason. So you've got appraisal. You've also got a physical response. So this is like literally the body response to whatever it is. You've got facial expression, which is like your face when I like do the eyebrow thing. That's my skeptical face. When I'm not gonna make a whole range of emotions for y'all. You've seen them through the videos. But yeah, so facial expressions are a good hint. You've also got like nonverbal behavior and motives to perform a behavior based on emotion. So these can happen in any order. Like the physical response can occur before the appraisal, so our body response before we know why. And so it's kind of from an uninformed perspective, it feels messy. But, you know, there's logic in here. Like they're all happening at the same time. Or not. It's an interesting area with a wide range of mechanisms to understand. These can lead to a complex mixture of thought, physical sensations, and motivations. And like possible sources of emotion include like immediate stimuli, kind of classic conditioning, memories or thoughts. All of those can be the primer for motivation, for emotions. Now, similar to how there are kind of like universal or close to universal personality traits, there are close to universal, or at least kind of core emotions, and these are happiness, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, and disgust. 6. And these core emotions basically have the same meaning and means of expression across cultures. Now, the thinking is that these emotions are universal because they were evolutionarily advantageous. For example, anger. Anger is when, I will leave this as an exercise for the watcher to explain why anger is evolutionarily advantageous. And there's different ways to model emotions, not just like from a statistical standpoint, but to think about them. I'm going to show you the circumplex model on the next slide. So you can kind of break emotions down into two dimensions. You've got positive versus negative. And like this whole model assumes that they're in those two dimensions. And that you can kind of map every emotion onto those aspects. So we've got, okay, pen. I want a different color. Alright, so that first dimension, we got aroused versus unaroused. And so every emotion has some level of arousal, as well as some level of negative versus positive valence. This is a useful way to compare emotions to each other. Now, you can have like emotions that don't elicit positive or negative. So they're like right in the middle here. So just being unaroused without like positive or negative just puts you like dazed, lethargic, solemn, or sleepy. And the closer you get, like you can have positive emotions that are low arousal, like nostalgia, humbleness, versus like negative, where a misery and a shame. And a way to kind of think about like splitting the difference between negative and unaroused is bored. And the trade-off, like the opposite of bored, is excited, which is like positive, high arousal. Bored is negative, low arousal. So you can slice this model up like two ways. So there are two, so you could either do like excitement versus boredom and alarm versus serene, kind of have like a cross one, or like this. They're equivalent. Because they both kind of capture the dimensions. And this is a really useful way to compare between emotions. So like the difference between like being amused or envious is the level of negative versus positive, while they're the same kind of level of arousal. So they're both high arousal, but different positive or negative, which I think is pretty neat. Alright, so here's a nice table to kind of illustrate emotions with different stimuli and responses and functions. For example, anger is typically provoked through like threat or trespass, and the typical response is either to threaten or attack, and the adaptive function is protecting territory or resources or mates. And these are kind of 5 examples here to give you some sense of what's going on. Boom. So there are individual differences in emotion. Unsurprisingly, I mean, we are in an individual differences class. And these differences are core aspects of personality. So extroversion and neuroticism really heavily influenced by emotion. Extroversion is characterized by positive emotionality versus neuroticism, which is characterized by negative emotionality. And now people lower on extroversion. That's not to say that they don't experience, like, so being introverted means that you experience fewer positive emotions. It doesn't mean that you start to experience negative emotions. So these are two dimensions here. So experiencing of positive links with extroversion versus experiencing of negative, because you can be emotionally stable and introverted and just not experience a lot of any emotions. Or you can be super extroverted and super neurotic and experience lots of all of them, versus like being neurotic and introverted versus like all the combinations exist. They're orthogonal. They're uncorrelated. Cool. Now, people also differ beyond just like their experiencing of them, in their preference for experiencing certain kinds of emotions. Some people experience emotions more strongly than others. Some folks are really high intensity. Women in general tend to report higher emotional intensity than men. And it's actually a risk factor for bad outcomes. So that level of intensity seems to be related with emotion, with depression. And also, like, it can, sorry, my notes are like kind of smushed together and they're a little further away. So, yeah. For example, like with depression, seeing one event as very positive can actually make other events appear more negative in comparison. And there's actually some health consequences too, such as too much physiological arousal may harm the heart and immune system. So it's not all good. Now, rates of change in levels of emotion, like emotional, like roller coasters. So higher rates tend to be associated with being described by others as generally more fearful and hostile. So emotional volatility. So not just like the steady average, but the variance. So people with higher levels of neuroticism tend to be more emotionally volatile. There's more variance. There's more changes. And borderline personality disorder is kind of characterized by lots of volatility. And we'll talk about that in the next module. But oh boy, I have some not so fun experiences with borderline. The emotional roller coaster is real. We'll talk about it. Not my experiences personally, but we'll talk about borderline. Now, lastly on this slide, I have a little comment about emotional intelligence. So, as a definition, it seems to be related to emotional expressiveness and quality of personal relationships, levels of optimism, and cognitive control. In terms of definition, it's about accurate perception of emotions in oneself and others, as well as controlling and regulating them. So the reason why I have problems with this construct is so self-reported scales find this measure, but we don't find that people in tests are more likely to identify the correct, like a behavioral measure of emotional intelligence doesn't seem to add any predictive validity. Like, it doesn't. I don't know what to make of it. I waffle. But in general, I have some doubts about this as a construct. And that it's not just like personality characteristics. I don't think it's like an ability the same way like cognitive ability is. So I'm going to kind of leave with these kind of concluding thoughts. Personality is a verb. The things people do are personality processes. Also, this is the default Microsoft machine learning icon, which I love. So, personality is something that a person does. It's thoughts, feelings, behaviors, perceptions. It's all those things. It's not just this latent, like, trait floating above your head that you try and measure. It's more than that. Alright, so next time I will talk about happiness and positive psychology. So I'll see you then. Bye-bye.